Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'd really like to thank Mr. Abdul Hadi and ASHRM for inviting me to talk to you all today. As Malak said in the introduction, I think we live in very interesting times. A lot of things changing in business, and I was very interested in Dr. Biryari's talk about STC. I mean, there are many points of that story which are as good as any story that I hear about organizations around the world. So it shows that I think innovation and thinking about people and putting people at the heart of business is happening everywhere. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the context of change that we see and how HR is responding. Just to give you a little bit of background on the CIPD. The CIPD is the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. So we're the professional body for HR and people development. We've been around for 100 years, which is extraordinary, and interestingly started 100 years ago in the United Kingdom as the Welfare Workers Association, which was all about looking after people. Today we have close on 150,000 members. We have an office in Dubai here, which we opened last year, around 3,000 or so members across the region, the GCC region. And our remit, our purpose is ultimately to help champion better work and working lives, but by building a stronger HR profession. And I'm really pleased, as I said, to be here to demonstrate also our commitment to the region and our commitment to working with ASHRM in helping to build a stronger HR profession. So I'm going to talk, first of all, a bit about some of the contextual changes that are happening, and then how we are seeing HR respond to this new world. And hopefully the mic will work if yes, it is, good. Not that the camera's followed me, but never mind. There we go. Because I like to walk around, bring a bit more energy. So first of all, what are some of the themes shaping the world of work today? Well, there is a lot of economic change, a lot of economic uncertainty. I don't have to tell you in this part of the world about things like the price of oil, which was a very hard thing to have predicted a few years ago. So everybody now talks about an economy globally that we're living in, which is very unpredictable, very uncertain. And that creates the need for much greater agility. We have to be able to respond quicker. We've got to do some of the things like Dr. Biryari talked about in STC, creating a more agile organization. And that's important for all of us, because frankly, it is very hard to predict what's going to happen next. Technology, of course, a huge disruptor. New business models, new ways of working. I was rather struck. I think you have Uber in the region, do you, as a taxi company? Have you? Well, Uber is you can just call up Uber or have an app on your phone and a car will arrive. Airbnb, is that a business model that you've seen in this part of the world? So here are two new businesses that have emerged in the last 2 or 3 years. So Uber, which is a big taxi company effectively, owns no taxis and it has no employees, but it's fast becoming one of the biggest taxi companies in the world. It is simply bringing customers together with drivers and cars and created a new business model. Or Airbnb is going to become one of the biggest hospitality companies and owns no real estate, no hotels, and no personnel. Again, it's bringing customers together with people who want to share their premises. It might be their private homes or their hotels or whatever with customers. Or Facebook, another huge organization now with almost no assets. So technology is an enormous driver in shaping new types of organization, and as we'll see in a moment, also shaping new types of jobs and ways of working. And then finally, I always think and talk a lot about the workforce and the demographics of the workforce. We're now seeing organizations with 4 or 5 different generations of workers in their organizations. So the baby boom generation, or even the pre-baby boom generation, the Gen Xers, Gen Y, and just when we thought we were almost understood Generation Y, along is coming the next generation, Gen Z. And I've got 3 daughters, 2 daughters who are Gen Y, and one who is Gen Z. She's 17 years old. And my older daughters think there's something wrong with my youngest daughter because she is permanently wired to her phone, her laptop, her iPad. She is a true digital native. She's grown up with technology. And this generation, Gen Y, has been researched and studied more than any other generation in the world, and now we're starting to research Gen Z. And Gen Z, amongst other things, are going to be further extending this idea of individual. It's about me as an individual. And that they've grown up in a world, particularly with technology, where they can personalize everything. And that's a very important trend because in the world of work, we have typically tried to treat people more like the same. We create common policies, common talent management practices to try to treat people the same because it's simpler. And in business, most of us have spent a long time, and I worked for many years as a consultant, trying to simplify things, standardize things. And in this world, with all these changing demographics, all these different generations, all this technology disruption, all these different ways of working, one thing is for sure, and that the future will be much more diverse in every way than the past. So we have to adapt our business thinking and practices accordingly. So as we look at these changing contexts, we've been researching a lot of these trends, and we talk about them as the mega trends. So I've already said that in terms of the economy, much more volatile, much less predictable. That value is shifting towards intangible, and I'll show you another slide that explains that a little bit more. But the value is not, of enterprises today, is not so much what you see on the balance sheet or what you see in the P&L statements. I mean, at STC, your brand value, which you described, is the thing that's driving a huge amount of your market value. So that's really important because what intangibles is another word for is we haven't figured out how to measure it properly, right? So this is an important agenda for business leaders, for accountants, and it's certainly an important agenda for HR people because the other big source of value, and ultimately the key source of value, of course, is people. And then, as I said, the changing nature of work, the changing nature of the workforce, and the changing nature of the workplace. And very different organizational models emerging. I mentioned Uber and B&B, but there are lots of debates about new organizational models, which we've read about, where you have entirely democratic workplaces, where the employees get together to decide what to do. So you might have heard of Zappos, which has been talked about a great deal, or Morningstar, or WL Gore. We're seeing these same sorts of companies being used as examples. And what I would say to you is they're interesting, and it's interesting to think about how you can create a very different business model which is entirely democratic. But I would also say to you, if you run a nuclear power plant or an oil refinery, I don't think it's about democracy in the workplace. You've got to run nuclear power plants with a lot of rules. And if you don't have all those rules, then we're all in trouble. So the answer is, as we look at these different business models, is not that here's the new world that we're all going to be looking like. It's that here is a new world with many different varieties of organization, an organization model, and it's figuring out what's the right one for us and the kind of organization that we are. So, of course, in terms of Middle East context, not only, I think it was called the oil shock, wasn't it, back in the 1970s, but we're certainly going through an oil shock now with the reduction of oil. But we have been through these sorts of things in the past. I mean, my own country, the United Kingdom, had a higher dependency on oil in places like Scotland, but they've built new businesses and new industries. So things adapt. And of course, this is going to be one of the challenges for the region, is how do we extend the range of organizations, the range of businesses, the range of revenue streams, if the future world is one where oil can be less depended upon to drive the economy. What does that mean to the wider economy in the Middle East and in the GCC? You also, of course, have one of the youngest demographics of populations in the world. I come from Europe. Actually, I say that now. June 23rd, maybe I won't be saying I come from Europe because we have the referendum in the United Kingdom about whether we should stay in Europe. But Europe is an aging population. It's an aging population. The average age across Europe now is close to 40. whereas in this part of the world, it's in its late 20s. So you have a very different age profile and age demographic. But that also says that you've got to make sure that you're giving opportunities to the younger generation. And the younger generations are more demanding. And I see this in a lot of organizations today where you've got older workforces, and young people come in, and they see all these older workers, and they say, I want that job, or I want that job, and the older person is still there. So you end up with the younger person perhaps not staying as long, because they're seeing that they think that their progress is being blocked by the people ahead of them, the older generations. And that's happening in companies in the West today, and I know is one of the issues here. And of course, diversity, another very, very important topic. And diversity in every kind. I mean, we talk a lot about gender diversity, of course, in this part of the world, and believe me, we talk a lot about gender diversity in Europe as well, because we still do not have, we're still not making the best use of female and women talent in organizations in the West. You know that McKinsey, since we've already quoted McKinsey on their Organizational Health Index, wrote an interesting report where they said that if we could get greater gender equality across the world in terms of work, that could drive an additional $12 trillion to the global economy, which is staggering. So the issue of diversity is really about using all of the skills and talents of our workforces, wherever they are. So you can talk about gender diversity, we can talk about educational diversity, I've already touched on generational diversity. And these are really, really important themes for us everywhere. How do we manage and support a more diverse workforce and move away from a one-size-fits-all? So I said I was going to talk briefly about value, intangible value. I think this is an interesting report. So CGMA is one of the Global Management Accountants Association, with a survey of 300 global executives, asking them what they thought was most contributing to their organizational value. And just as Dr. Biriari said, you know, it's all these other things. It's the customer relationships, therefore your brand representation, the knowledge and human capital, so that the knowledge that's inherent in the business and inherent in your people and the capabilities of your people. It's technology. How are you using technology? Are you investing in technology that creates greater productivity from your people and delivers a better outcome for your customers? Have you got strategic vision and so on? So today's businesses are being determined by these so-called more intangible things about people, about brand, about customer and supplier relationships and so on. And as you've already said, we have to measure these things better. And of course, at the very heart of the debate about HR for a long time now is that we've got to get better at measuring what we support and the value that HR brings to the organization. And that is about people, it is about relationships, it is about things like learning and learning capability, and it absolutely is about things like culture and corporate culture. So this is the world we now live in. And as I say, we have quite some way to go still to adapt our thinking, our processes, our measurement systems, and indeed what we hold businesses accountable for today, because a lot of it is still, frankly, stuck in the 20th century. And the 21st century is a different world. So this is very important stuff for all kinds of businesses. I also said I was going to touch briefly on technology and how it's impacting jobs. I'm writing and talking a lot now about the future of work. Everybody's debating, what is the future of work? How are we going to work, and what kind of jobs are we going to do? And there are a lot of very interesting surveys and studies that have been done by looking at technology today and saying what kind of jobs could be done by a computer, by a robot, or by artificial intelligence. And you know that artificial intelligence now has reached the level where, certainly on cognitive processing ability, it's as good as we are. You might have heard of something called the Turing test. So Alan Turing, one of the godfathers of computing, devised this test, and he predicted, and this is back in the 1940s, 1950s, that at some point technology would reach the place where you would not know if you were asking questions of a human being or a computer who you were talking to. Were you talking to a machine, or were you talking to a person? And when it comes to knowledge and cognitive ability, Watson's big supercomputer, IBM's big supercomputer called Watson apparently has passed that kind of test. You can ask a person, you can't see them obviously, or a computer, and you can't see the computer, and you can't tell the difference. So what does this mean when we now have the ability with machines, even today, to exceed or certainly equal the cognitive capability of the human being? And this is what some of these projections are telling us, that in the next 15, 20 years, that as many as half the jobs that we do today could be done by a computer. I always look at these lists and say it's interesting to see, I don't see HR on that list. So, we're all okay, right? There's also an expression which I rather love. You've probably have you heard of fear of missing out? FOMO. If you've got young children, you'll know what I'm talking about. FOMO. Well, now we've got FOBO. Fear of becoming obsolete, right? So this is a really interesting debate, right? So if this was to come to pass, that half the jobs that we do today could be done by a computer, what does that mean for the rest of us? What are we going to be doing? And is this a better world than the one we have today? I would contend that we must design for this kind of future. I, for one, do not want to stand by while computers come in and take all these jobs and leave us with not very much to do. Many people in the world of work would say that technology has been disempowering them and de-skilling them. Now, in our everyday lives, it's profound. I mean, we can shop where we want, we can buy holidays where we want, we can have all these experiences online. When we come to work, it's often a very different experience. The computer is controlling us. We're almost enslaved by it. It may be not quite such a strong culture here, but in many parts of the world, you're always on. It's this idea, always on. In other words, I leave work and then I go home, but I'm checking my emails and I'm looking at my iPad and checking texts, and then I have to check Facebook, I have to check Twitter, I have to check my personal email, my work email. And I think, well, what's going on? We're just working harder and harder. And in fact, all the evidence, all the surveys show that we are working harder, but we're not necessarily working smarter. And the future has got to be designed for, and HR has got to play its part in designing a future of work that is good for people. It's not just about what technology can do, it's what we want it to do and what enables the best relationship between man and machine, if you will, the best relationship. I'll give you one more thought on this, and this is something known as Moravec's paradox. So I've said that computers can do cognitive things really well. What they're not very good at is sensory motor skills and things like emotion, intuition, and judgment. Now, what is interesting about those skills is those are the skills that we as people, as human beings, have had for the longest. Those were the original skills we kind of developed as a human species. Our ability, sensory motor, our ability, fear, flight, and fright, all those sorts of emotional things, they're deeply rooted in our brain. And I'm sure when Dr. Alan Watkins talks, he'll talk about some of this stuff. But the new stuff that are, the newer parts of the brain that have evolved are about cognitive ability. So it's about how do we use judgment and intuition and emotion and empathy and all these other things. And so my point on all of this ultimately is that the future of work is human. The future of work is human. Whatever we do with technology, the future of work is human. So, amongst other things, in terms of all this change of jobs that's going on, is this. That what we are seeing is a growing mismatch between the skills of the workforce and the educational systems that we have and the kinds of jobs that we are creating now and will create in the future. Some people say that the most popular jobs now did not exist 10 years ago. I read a survey the other day that suggested 2/3 of the jobs that people who are currently at school will do have not yet been invented. So how do you create an educational system that better meets the needs of work? And certainly, to me, it puts at the center of a lot of strategic capability in organizations around HR is actually around learning and development. It's upskilling and reskilling your workforce. It's about job design that makes the best use of the skills and capabilities that you have in your workforce so that you've got a better match between jobs and people. So these are very profound shifts that we're seeing, and we are not well adapted to this anywhere. And we have this debate a great deal in Europe now about the mismatch of higher education, in particular, to the world of work. As the CIPD, we did a survey on this recently, and in the UK, we estimated that 60% of graduates were working in non-graduate jobs. 60%. And we can't keep doing that. We can't keep educating all our young people, giving them all this expectation, and not having the jobs that use their skills best. So this is a really important part of the debate as well. So we've already heard from Dr. Biari that the reality is that so it's about a people-centered organization. It's about putting people first. And I love Vineet Nayar's book, and I've read it, and I've met Vineet Nayar as well, the chief executive of HCL. Because he talks, we're all talking about this stuff. Put the person at the center. But that means you've got to listen to them, voice, because this is one of the most important things, particularly with the younger generation. And I don't care where you are in the world. I've met young people from Brazil to Japan to China to the Middle East. They all broadly want the same thing. They want to be heard. They have a voice, and they expect you to listen. We need to worry a lot more about well-being and engagement. And as you said, we need to measure these things. And what does well-being mean? Well, well-being, and it's obviously engagement kind of extends into this idea of well-being, is about physical well-being, it's about emotional well-being, it's about financial well-being. And going back to my point earlier about work and how work and technology, we seem to be working harder but not smarter, is that stress in the workplace now is one of the biggest issues that we face because people are feeling more stressed out. So how we support well-being, seeing that a well employee who's engaged and who we're listening to is also going to be a more productive employee, more aligned to the values of the organization, and delivering what we want for our customers. These are the essential parts and the absolute core of what we need to be worrying about from an HR professional standpoint. And it's fantastic to listen to chief executives who get this stuff, because not every chief executive does. And we need to make sure that we are measuring these things, because as we've already heard from STC, these things do drive outcome. They drive productivity, they drive agility, and they drive all the things ultimately that are really important to future organizational success. So these human elements of work are what must be central. And it's about the future work as human, but it's also about putting human into human resources. And it's the whole theme of the ASHRM conference as we stand here today, about putting the human into work. And this is the central part of our responsibility. And I think we would all agree this is not what has been historically the focus in most organizations. In most organizations, this has been about process, about cost efficiency, about financial measures and all these other things. And yet, actually, it is these things that drive the longer-term sustainable value of business. So this is a big shift. It's a big shift. And then, you know, we talk a lot about HR as needing to kind of own and sustain and support these agendas of putting people first. But it's this guy, this person, who's most crucial. It's the line manager. And I think, for one, maybe we should all walk around with a sign on our back saying, "How good's my managing?" Because we should be holding our line managers accountable for how well they look after their people. And that says we've got to train them more. Historically, everywhere I've been over the last 20 years, we have not done enough in training our line managers to be good people managers. Because whatever we do in HR, we can write great well-being programs and engagement programs and all these other things. At the end of the day, the biggest influencer, and you know it, we all know it, we've all worked for good managers and bad managers. At the end of the day, this person has the greatest impact on your day-to-day engagement, your day-to-day well-being, how much you trust the organization, and so on. And we have to train these managers better. And particularly in a world, which I've described, where we've got more and more diverse workforces. And we've got to treat people as individuals. And we've got to train them to do it. Now, sometimes, I've seen some real innovation in this stuff, because you talk about training, and you've got to train people to be good people managers. But I was doing work with one of the big airlines recently. And airlines, and I'm sure some of you work in the airline industry, like many businesses, are very, very operational business. It's all about the operations. It's about getting the plane turned around on time and doing all the processes that you have and all these checklists. It's a very process-driven world. And they recognized they were not looking after their people, and the managers were not looking after their people. So they gave, and particularly in shift work, so you might have a line manager, but his or her team is changing day to day because of shift work. So they developed an app, and they gave it to their managers on their phones and said, here is an app, and what that app tells you is who is on your team today, who's working for you, right? And we all know this stuff. I mean, so at the first level, it was saying, okay, so I can see Bill and George and Anne are all working for me today, so I can go and introduce myself or say hi to them and use their name. And it's simple things like that are actually quite impactful. So who's working for me? When might their birthday be, or some special event, or what was the last training they went on, or where are their areas of development? Just giving the manager simple information. So it's not always just about sitting them in a classroom and telling them to be better people managers. We've got to equip them to do it as well. And then we've got to coach them, and we've got to reward them on that basis too. You can't sustain cultural change, behavioral change, and all these other things unless you're measuring the right thing and holding people to account for it. So these are some of the big things going on. So just to move it forwards for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it to questions. So I've talked about a lot of different trends, echoed a number of things we already heard, what's important in business today, and I think these are universal challenges. It doesn't matter where we are. So how do we respond? Well, the first thing I would say is that for HR, we've talked a lot about HR becoming more strategic, really engaging with business leadership. And the first thing you have to understand is, what is the strategy of the business? What's this business about? What's its purpose? Where's it going? This is what we talk about as being business savvy. And that may be the organization as a whole, or if you're operating in a division or department, understand what is driving the strategy or thinking for that part of the organization. Business priorities and business needs. And then secondly is to say, all right, well, given that, and given the projection over the next 3 to 5 years, what kind of workforce or culture do we need to be building for? What are we going to create? And what skills and capabilities are we going to need? And what are our options? I mean, going back to this technology thing, should I automate all these jobs? Should I invest in technology here and invest people there? How do I do that? And how do I do it in a way that creates meaningful work and engages people effectively? So this is, I think, this is our core space as HR. I use this phrase, content is king, but context is kingdom, because what we are seeing with the things I talked about before, changing nature of work, the changing nature of the workforce, and the changing nature of the workplace, that is the context for organizations everywhere. And to me, if we as HR professionals do not understand that context, then we're not doing our job. Because it is our space, this stuff. So then how does that apply to our organization, and how do we respond? And then behind that, yes, absolutely, what have we got to do to HR in terms of capabilities to build, to support that? And I think often we've confused that bottom box with the middle box. We said, okay, here's a great organizational strategy. I kind of get that. Now I'm going to tell everybody about what I'm doing to HR. I'm going to make it more efficient, or I'm going to spend less money, or I'm going to put in a new performance management system. But it's the bit in the middle that's missing. How do we understand the real connection between the people, the organization, the culture, the talents and skills that we have, and supporting and enabling and even sometimes challenging the business strategy? And then another thought I would give you, this is where I think HR also is really starting to change and shift, is from control to enablement, from policy to principles. I bet if you added up in your organization the number of HR policies that we've got, you would have quite a big pile. I have said publicly, and when I do it, I will share it with you, that I'm going to burn half the policies, at least half the policies we have within the CIPD. A lot of these policies were written in a time when we felt that the right way to manage people was to write a lot of rules. And that's the way to manage people. Now, we know that doesn't work, don't we? We have known through decades of behavioral science research that writing more rules does not create the behaviors that you want. And if you don't believe me, go back to some of the, Google this, the Milgram experiments of the 1960s, the studies of obedience. People will do some pretty bizarre and sometimes terrible things if you just give them a whole bunch of rules and tell them that's what you've got to do. What you want is you want to enable people and empower them and to give them the responsibility. The whole employees first idea is very much built around that principle, to give people more authority and accountability to do what is right for the customer based on principles and not based on a whole bunch of rules. But we have built that world over the last 20 or 30 years. It is the common paradigm of work of the 20th century, is the right way to manage people, is to standardize everything, as I said, and then put in a whole bunch of rules. And HR has been as guilty of that as anybody. So this is a real challenge, and I love Dilbert. You've probably read the cartoon by now, so I won't spell it out. But Dilbert describes it really well. I think most of the organization does think that HR has got some random policy generator that it's been churning out policies with. And we've got to be prepared to challenge ourselves on this and to create a culture that is more enabling and more empowering and built on clear principles of what we expect, and then rewarding those things as opposed to telling people what are all the rules. So, in terms then of the two or three final points, so what does this mean then for our core practices in HR? And the core of HR for so long has been what we call talent management, people management, right? So how do we find the right people? How do we attract them? How do we induct them? How do we develop them? How do we do performance management? How do we reward them? Now, I think in the world of HR, as we see it, that there is a lot of innovation happening because we are standing back from some of these things and starting to challenge some key principles. Dr. Biari, you mentioned performance management. And I know this is a big subject across the world of HR at the moment. Performance management has been one of the central platforms of HR. And I usually ask the question, what do we think is the purpose of performance management? And it's not a trick question. The purpose of performance management should be to improve performance. But all this stuff that we've been doing, these biannual reviews and all this documentation we've written, fundamentally it's not really been doing that. In fact, what it's tended to do is to say to managers that, first of all, this is going to be a hard conversation, but it's okay because you only have to have it every 6 months, right? And every 6 months, you're going to sit down with your employee and you're going to tell them what they should have been doing better. And you're going to tell them on the basis of some objectives, which they probably wrote about 9 months before and have changed anyway. And then the manager sits down, they can't remember half this, or they might have a few anecdotes or stories about this person, but they've forgotten because it was 3 or 4 months ago when that event happened. And we all know that performance management, the essence of performance management, is about the regular conversation. It's about engaging managers with their teams. And my goodness, if you're employing Gen Y employees, and just wait for Gen Z, they demand this. They demand it. They want regular feedback. And why shouldn't they? Because that's the right thing to do. And in many organizations, this performance management stuff has just been getting in the way. So what we have seen, and this is one of the central areas of innovation of HR, as I said, is going back to the purpose of what we do. Why do we do these things? What's the purpose of performance management? What's the purpose of my learning programs or anything else? And when you unpick it from that dimension, then you come at it from a different way. So all I'd say to you is, much like I said around rules, so yes, you can look at my alma mater, Accenture, and Pricewaterhouse, and KPMG, and McKinsey, and GE, and Microsoft, and all these companies that stood at the very epicenter of an idea of performance management, which was this process and what was called forced distribution, what our American colleagues would call rank and yank. So you rank them, and when they're performing low, you pull them out. But we haven't been doing that properly, because I'll tell you, in my experience, so we do all this documentation, and why do we do all the documentation? Why do we ask managers to write all this stuff up? So that, in theory, we can go to these low performers and say, right, I've got all the documentation, so now I can fire you, because you're not performing well. And when we go to look at, we all know who the low performers are, and we go and look at the documentation, and what does it say? It usually says, this person has been performing satisfactorily, full stop. We don't even write this stuff down. So these organizations have deconstructed the process and said, what I want my managers to do is to talk and coach and support their teams. And through that process of regular engagement, they will know who's performing and who's not. And then the conversation that you might have in the mid-year and the final year review is about potential and about direction and about career progression. And that's what's changing. But again, any of these processes, as people are deconstructing them and reconstructing them, is about what is right for your business. I was talking to one of the big UK government departments about this last week, and they all said to me, yeah, well, you see, the problem is, in the civil service, we like process, and managers like process, so they like performance management process. I said, okay, let's simplify it. Simplify it. Make it easier. Make sure they're focused on the right stuff. So it is whatever works in your organization, what kind of culture you're trying to create, and what best supports your people. But then the other part of HR, which I don't think we spent enough time on, and I've talked about quite a lot this morning already, is we have got to get a lot better at being the real change agents, the disruptors, the entrepreneurs in the business, about helping to build the business of the future, the workforce of the future, the culture of the future, the organization of the future. And what's that got to look like in support of the business strategy? What kind of jobs are we trying to design that make the best use of our people and give them progression opportunities and all these other things that are so important in the world of work? So this is a really, really important agenda for us. And we don't have all the capabilities we should have, if we're honest. We need to build these sorts of capabilities more. We need to work closely with business leaders on what kind of culture have we got today, what are we trying to create for the future. And I don't think we'll all have such a dramatic result as you've achieved at STC, which is phenomenal to see that level of culture change in that period of time. Because you know how long culture change typically takes. It takes sometimes decades, but it starts from the top. So I salute you. It starts from the top. But this is what we need to focus on far more as an HR profession. How do you design good jobs, organization structures? What are your options? How do you make the best use of your talent? What kind of culture are you trying to create? And then that we measure those things. Because the measurement thing, we know, is still quite a challenge for us, if we're honest. And I always say with this human capital measurements and analytics, if it was easy, we would have done it a long time ago. And it isn't always easy. But start with the basics. Start by measuring things like engagement. Understand the dimensions of your corporate culture. But also, for heaven's sake, understand the basics. Understand the composition of your workforce. Where is the diversity at different levels? And a lot of people struggle even with this one. I mean, if you said, what is the head count in my business? How many people do I employ? You'll probably end up with an argument between HR and finance. You recognize that one? And who wins that argument? Right? Finance, yeah? Well, how crazy is this? Why don't we just work together with finance and figure out the right answer? Finance, as I've already pointed out, have just as much reason to want to understand this stuff as we do as HR. It's about the value of the enterprise, which they're not measuring properly either. So let's start by working together. So one of the things we've been doing a lot as the CIPD, and we've been doing it in this part of the world as well, is to understand current practice in analytics, pull out the good case studies, share common frameworks and models, and we are working together with the finance and accounting profession to agree common standards. Because we have to measure this stuff better, and we have to know where we are creating value, where we're destroying it, and all the way from the basic composition of our workforce all the way up to things like corporate culture. So this remains a really big agenda, but it is not about us doing this on our own. It's about working particularly, as I said, with our finance and accounting colleagues and business leadership. So, very important. And if you're interested in this stuff, incidentally, valuing your talent, if you Google valuing your talent, you'll find a lot of information out there, all these different case studies, these frameworks we're developing, working with a lot of consultants and others, because we and I profoundly believe this must be part of our future. As you said, Dr. Biari, you can't do what you can't measure. And you have to measure these things to be able to take them more seriously. So, with all of that, and yes, and the quotes, where's it gone? It's disappeared. Anyway, I'll tell you the quote because it's an Einstein quote. Einstein said that not everything that counts can be counted, And not everything that is counted counts. And we are not measuring all the right things. You can take it all up to the macro level as well, because in economies we measure GDP. It was Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, who a long time ago in the 1960s said, the problem with GDP, it is measuring everything but that which is important. And for you who are Emiratis, I was really excited to see that in the UAE, you've appointed a Minister of State for Happiness. Isn't that cool? Because actually happiness and well-being should be one of the things that we measure at a national level as much as we measure it at a company level. And to me, there's no clearer example of what Einstein meant. We are not always counting the right things. And then finally, there's a lot we need to embed back into the heart of HR, which is about people behavior, why they do the things they do, understanding neuroscience, behavioral economics. I'm a huge fan of things like Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, or Dan Pink's book, Drive, or The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And all of that stuff, we've known, as I said before, for a long time. We just need to use it more in our thinking about HR and delivering the right outcome for our organizations. So my final slide is this, which is, I've talked about a lot of things, but it's about pulling it together in a framework of a knowledge base for the profession. It starts with the understanding of the context, changing work, workforce, workplace. As I said before, if we don't understand this stuff as HR, I'm not sure whom else is going to bring that to the table. And we must understand it in the context of the organizations which we support and serve. We need more of the data on the left. We need to go back to the basics and roots of HR about people, behavioral science, neuroscience, and so forth, and inject that much more deeply in HR. And you're going to hear a bit more about that later today. And then finally, of course, innovate. Innovate. Have the courage to rip up your policies. Think differently about your processes in order to achieve the right outcome. And if we do that, we will create better organizations. We will create more opportunity for more people to have effective and successful and meaningful work and working lives. And if you think about that in the context of our economies, and it's particularly true in this part of the world, that is probably the most important agenda of all. We've got to engage our people better. We've got to give them more opportunity. We've got to support them better. We've got to create more diverse and inclusive working environments, because that is the future of our societies everywhere. And as I said, the future of work is human. So thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Shukran. Shukran.
Thank you, Peter. We've got some questions, and some of them are actually from our audience. So Mr. Salim from Oman Electricity Holding Company handed me this small paper. He says, Peter Cheese said, content is king, but context is kingdom. How do you make sure your HR strategies are aligned with your business strategies?
Yes. So that was a chart I showed earlier before. So these three boxes. Understanding, you have to start with the understanding of the organization, its strategy, its direction, its principles, its values, its purpose. And then it's about saying, well, given all of that, where am I today in terms of my workforce today? What measures have I got that help me understand how well that's aligned to the future? Work with the business leaders. I did say, actually, I think in today's world, understanding the human capital strategy, the kind of workforce we've got and what we want to create in the future, is also actually a challenge to our business strategy. Because business strategy is also about operating models and what kind of capabilities I need. And in today's world, if I can't find the people, certainly not if I can't find them here, where do I go? How do I find them? Do I partner with somebody else to do it? What are my core capabilities? So actually, the whole idea of human capital and business strategies to me are very deeply connected. And in the world of business and in the world of business schools, many of you might have done MBAs, and I talk a lot of business schools, we have not done enough teaching of business leaders on this stuff. We say, what's business strategy? Well, business strategy is about vision and direction. It's about market strategies, financial strategies, product strategies. But it must also be about people strategies. And that's and human capital. And that's about bringing HR and business leadership together to work on those ideas.
Peter, also you mentioned that these are very interesting times for HR. There have never been more exciting time for HR. We would like to hear more from you about how this applies to the Middle East. What are the trends you see here?
Well, as I said before, yes, I do. I really, really believe there's never been a more important time for HR. Yeah, I've been delighted at the kind of response that we've had as a professional organization in the Middle East. We've been talking to ministers of labor and all sorts of people, because I think you all know, I don't have to tell you, that the context of engaging our young people in meaningful work, of getting perhaps over time a better balance between indigenous populations and expat populations and business growth, and then shifting perhaps from very oil-based economies to more diverse economies. And these are huge contextual challenges for the Middle East. But it is going to be about how do we manage our people, how do we educate and support them in the right ways, how do we deal with some of the expectations and aspirations of the younger generation. And we as HR professionals can influence that within our organizations, but I also profoundly believe, and this is certainly part of our agenda, we can influence them more broadly as well, and at a societal level. And believe me, the contextual challenges, yes, you have particular contextual challenges in the Middle East, but I'm seeing the same debate going on everywhere. We're having the same debate in Asia. We're having the same debate in the United Kingdom and Europe. How do we make better use of our workforces? How do we encourage more well-being, less stress, more balanced lives, more meaningful work? And how do we make better use of the skills and talents of the workforce? We cannot go on with the kind of mismatches we've got. So I think we are also at an inflection point. We have to do some of these things better. We've got to innovate more. We've got to move away from these paradigms of the past. And HR has such a profound role to play in all of that.
Peter, do you think there's a difference on how to apply these principles to different sectors? Are some sectors more challenging than others?
Yes, for sure. I mean, some sectors see this more than others. I mean, IT. I've worked a lot in IT and IT services. And I'm sure it's the same in the MENA region as it is in, say, India. Some of the biggest shortfalls in talent and skills are, not surprisingly, in places like IT, because it's changing so fast. I mean, let me just say cybersecurity to you. Cybersecurity. I mean, if you're not on that agenda now, and I'm sure you are at STC, if you're not on that agenda now, you have to be. And this, interestingly, finding people who understand cybersecurity and technology is very difficult. But it is also a people issue, because the biggest issue of technology is not the technology in terms of its security, it's the people and what they do and why they do the things they do. It is what is in cybersecurity is known as the insider threat. And we need, as HR professionals, to be working on that. But yes, of course, different sectors have different challenges. You can typically see the biggest challenges have been in IT and IT services. So interestingly, when you then, and I'm often asked, where's best HR practice? Where's the best innovation? You can often find it in IT or telecoms because you are facing as many challenges about attracting, recruiting, retaining people with the kinds of skills that you need, which are changing all the time, as much as any sector anywhere.
Right.
So yes, you see different things going on, but I think, I am now seeing innovation happening in all sectors. It's not just about the ones that have been most threatened, but we can learn from each other. We can learn across sectors. What works in, say, technology can also work in consumer products, and we need to share those ideas more.
Thank you, Peter. It was wonderful having you with us today.